Happy spring, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Herald and Lurvey's Garden Center virtual gardening series. This is the first of 4 in our series, and we are welcoming today Marty Mercer. He is the vegetable and herb specialist at Lurvey's, and that's one of the really beauty parts about going to Lurvey's is that anytime that you show up there, you'll have somebody who's an expert. Marty's been around for 35 years, and he knows vegetables and herbs like nobody else. And so today he's going to give us a great presentation on this, and we hope that all your questions will be answered, and we hope that you'll join us for all 4 of these. You can go to events.dailyherald.com to register for that, and I'll let you know what the next 3 are at the end of this webinar. So welcome, Marty, and I'm very interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. We practice social distancing pretty seriously with intent here. So I have a mask on now, but my mates are, well, far away from me. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my mask. But this is not, you only do this like in a circumstance like this. So hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here with us in Lurvey and working with Daily Herald. Really appreciate it. And really happy to share with you some of the things that I know about herbs and vegetables during these times, especially. What a more beautiful thing to do. And what is really nice about the garden is having that solace, serenity, and then the experience of being out there with living things, whether it's the plants or the little critters that come and pollinators and all that stuff. So it's a really beautiful thing, and really glad to have you guys along. So we'll get started. I'm going to talk about a few things, experience vegetable gardens, beginners. We'll kind of go through. I think I'd like to start out with tomatoes, because who doesn't grow tomatoes in a vegetable garden? What's nice about Lurvey is we have quite a few varieties of all these different vegetables, particularly ones we'll talk about today. For example, right now on the tables, we have 20 different varieties of peppers, have about 15, maybe 18 varieties of tomatoes. And we're expecting many more types and varieties to come in. Wanted to, for both the experienced gardener and the beginner, there's an aspect about growing tomatoes that's very important in terms of clarity on what to expect. And that is the ideal that there are indeterminate tomatoes and determinate tomatoes. The reason this is important is for a couple reasons. I have a determinate tomato here, and they are only going to grow about 48 inches, maybe 52. It depends on the variety. They're going to stay pretty narrow and compact. And as we go through the season, we'll start getting tomatoes off the determinates. But then there'll be when they hit maturity, there'll be a large flush of tomatoes. And after that, we'll still get some tomatoes from these determinates. So there'll be things like most of the paste tomatoes, Romas, San Marzano, and then the indeterminate tomatoes, something like Early Girl, some of the most of the heirlooms, they are the ones that continue to grow and grow and grow. And what's nice about them is that they produce pretty regular amounts of fruit throughout the entire season. So we always have tomatoes out there. They're always coming on, ripening. They hit maturity, and there'll be a larger blush at that time. But then after, we're going to still have these consistent production of tomatoes. And then the final thing for both experienced and beginners is on the determinants. We tend not to prune them. We want them to be kind of thick and lush. For structural integrity and whatnot. The indeterminates, there's a number of different ways and reasons to prune them. And there's a lot we could do a whole thing on that. But on the indeterminate, what I will say is, as your plant starts to develop and the side stems come off the main stem, right in that elbow are these little suckers that grow. And we want to go ahead and pinch those out of there. If we come back, we missed 1 or 2 and they're beginning to be good size, you can just use a hand snip or something if they're too big to pinch. And just go ahead and get those out. They're called suckers because they tend to suck nutrition, and we actually get often a lighter yield if we don't do that. And speaking of snipping and pinching, at the Garden Center, we have a lot of tools as well as plants and fertilizers and soil amendments and all that kind of stuff. But we also have hand pruners. This is one that we carry. It's a small one, but I like it because I can get into tight places. And largely what I find is in the vegetable garden, these little small ones like this are really all I need. So that's a cool thing, right? Tomatoes. The other thing about tomatoes, I think we have quite a number of varieties. You know, old standbys, early girls, better boys, beefsteak, the big honking tomatoes. But we also have quite a few heirlooms. There's a little bit of a trade-off on heirlooms. We may not get as big a yield. Their maturity dates tend to be a good 10, 15, 18 days further out. But it's an incredible experience if you haven't eaten an heirloom tomato. And you know, most grocery stores, certainly the ones we're most familiar with here in the area, you're not going to see them readily or have them available. And the difference in flavor and subtlety, texture, color is really quite striking. So if you have the space, it might be good to consider one of those. And we have a number of varieties of those as well. So for both the experienced and beginner gardener, what I see, I also do plant health along with my professor Paul and Tom, and people come in with questions. And what I often do see is that the spacing is too tight on tomato plants particularly. We want to get a lot of airflow, and we want good light energy to be hitting into the plant. And if we have the tomatoes too close together, they really kind of crowd each other out and create airflow problems, which might lead to some disease or maybe some insect issues, but overall less vigor and vitality in our plants. That's another reason, particularly on the indeterminates, to pinch those suckers out. So our plant is lighter, more open, and we get better air circulation. It's a beautiful thing, this gardening stuff.
Hey, Marty.
Yeah.
Hey, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Which type of these plants is better for container gardening?
Right, that's a great question. So we basically can grow any plant in a container. There are exceptions. Tomatoes, we can grow in containers. It would be best to have at minimum a 5-gallon container with potting soil, so there's as much root growth as we can get to support the plant. It's important to remember when we do grow in containers that plants tend to grow to the size of the container. But basically, almost all of these vegetables and herbs we can grow in containers and do it really quite well. Yeah, and with the herbs, sometimes it's advantageous, right? So you get to the end of the season and your herbs are still there. If we have the right conditions inside, it's a little dicey, but if we have the right conditions inside, we can bring them in easily in that container that you grew them in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I was just wondering if between the determinate and the indeterminate, if there was one that would be preferable.
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. Of course, yeah, determinates are would be much better for containers. Even with the determinants, with the structural aspect of them, you know, we do need to have some kind of stake in there just to make sure that they don't tip over from the weight of the plant and the tomatoes themselves. The indeterminates, however it is that we grow them, we definitely need to cage them or stake them because they will fall. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a great question. And we have at the Garden Center, we have different size things like starter plants in 4.5-inch containers. This is actually this is a black creme heirloom tomato, really healthy, looking good, and eggplants. We have some herbs in 4-inch, and then we do step up to some larger plants too, if that's what you're looking for. We try to have a variety of things always here. Real quick before and also, if you're growing, just a little side note, it's a small fruit, but if you're growing berries, blueberries, experienced and beginning gardener. There's the chemistry of having the pH down really quite acidic. So if you haven't checked, if you've already started blueberries and you haven't done a pH test already, really wise to do that to make sure that the buffers in our soil haven't started to shift the pH back up to alkaline. Just a little side note. One plant that we would never really be able to grow in a container, two of them in terms of vegetables, asparagus and garlic. The asparagus is one of the very few perennial vegetables that we sell in north central Illinois. So it needs to be in the ground. The nice thing about asparagus, once you establish an asparagus bed, it could be there 25 years, giving you asparagus season after season. There's a few tricks to asparagus for the first 2 years. We can go into that in more detail if you come in and see me. I'd be happy to talk about those things. So for myself, I've been doing this quite a long time. And for me, at this point, what I typically do in terms of started plants are things like tomatoes, peppers, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. And then a lot of my other things that I grow from seed. And that's something we can talk about if you come in and see me. It's a very viable option. If your budget's a little tight, seeds might be an alternative to get a little more variety in your vegetable garden. I think with beginning gardeners, however, I think it might be wise to start with started plants and choose the ones that you really know that you're going to really be interested in eating and taking advantage of. Some are a little easier to go through the season than others, and that might be helpful for beginner gardeners. Then as you move forward, we can start maybe doing some things in seeds. We have certain things that we never get started: radishes, carrots. Sometimes we have beets that are started. A number of plants that we just don't have started. But the nice thing is, very easy to plant them with seed and have really good success. We just need to follow the proper spacing and planting depth on the back of the seed packet. And then something like carrots, lettuces, the radishes, then we have to come back in after they germinate and pull the little baby plants in between so that they're at the right spacing. Do you have another question, or should I keep going?
You know what I was going to ask you about was, it seems like a lot of my neighbors are doing those raised beds.
Yes.
Is there an advantage to that, or is that something you need to do, or why are they doing that, I guess?
Yeah, and again, this is another great question, and we're moving. I think the question suggests seeing that more often. Raised beds are kind of like a giant container, but not really, because more often than not, we have them down on the ground. So we have, they're open on the bottom, in other words. The advantages to raised beds, we don't want them to be any more than 4 feet wide. So you could have a 4x4, 4x8. The reason we do 4 feet is that we can reach from either side all the way to the middle to tend to our plants and weeding and that sort of thing. Another real strong benefit with raised beds is that we can determine exactly what our soil mix is going to be for the garden, for that particular garden box, raised bed. What type of compost, how much topsoil I have. Am I going to add coco coir as opposed to peat moss for friability and that sort of thing? And in fact, we have, if you come into the garden center, we have ratios built out to make that process a little simpler for 4x4s, 4x8s, and 4x10s. And also, we have them built out by depth, 8-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch. Another thing that's nice about raised beds is, now I haven't done it myself because I was in the ground, had an established vegetable garden, quite large, 600 square feet. But one of the advantages is you don't have footpaths, right? Because you can reach across both sides. So we find that we can get actually bigger yield in the same size space, believe it or not, than we do in a vegetable garden that's in the ground. So that's a great question, and it's certainly something to consider. And when I have the opportunity, I do plan to start developing some raised beds. What's also nice about them is that you can expand your garden really quite easily without, having to tear things up and that sort of thing. One thing I'd like to say about herbs, and it's also with the vegetables actually. So with beginning gardeners and experienced gardeners, the started plants, the financials, it may seem, initially like a lot of money. For instance, our 4-inch tomatoes and herbs, they're $3.99, right? But if you go to the grocery store and buy a little packet of dried herbs or fresh herbs, fresh herbs, you don't get very much for $5, $6, $7. Whereas if we grow them ourselves, whether in the ground or in containers, there they are, right? Starting to get mature, and then we're starting to pinch them back and use them for our cooking. If they get a little beyond us and, we don't plan to use that herb in the, let's say, thyme for the next couple of weeks, but we can take those cuttings, wrap a rubber band around the stem, hang them up and dry them, and then we'll have them, in the wintertime as well. Same thing with the berries. You can go to the grocery store and, buy a pint of raspberries, and, it's expensive. Whereas if you grow them in your own garden, and something like raspberries, very easy, there they are, Sometimes they don't even make it in the house because they're so good, and you're standing right there. But you get much more fresh raspberries that way for a lot less money in the long run. So I think that's something that's really important to bear in mind. And, I've grown all kinds of stuff myself. I've been doing this a long time. I have some tips and tricks that I know from experience. But it is, everybody I think knows or has heard that vegetables grown in your own garden are so much better than you can ever buy in the store. And that's absolutely right. It has to do with, shipping and the harvesting time, but also with the soils in our garden. And, the factors of having varieties to choose from, our own particular soils make everything truly better, fresher. If you've never eaten fresh broccoli out of your own garden, it's just an entirely different experience. I even found that I did 3 years of potatoes, really easy in a very small space. I averaged 150 pounds of tomatoes every year. And the first time I did it, I really did it just for fun and to see how it works. But I was amazed too that the potatoes themselves, who would have thought, are so much better grown in our own garden.
Can I ask you a question about the potatoes?
Sure.
Is it too late to grow now? Is it too late to grow potatoes now?
It's a little late. If you have the seed potatoes, you could go ahead and plant them now. They're not going to probably not have enough time to really reach maturity. And so, you won't end up with a lot of large potatoes, but you will have smaller ones. The best time to do it is in early April when the soils are workable. And it's a process. You can come in and talk to me about it. It's a process. There's some special things that we have to do with potatoes, but it's really quite easy. And I'll tell you, the flowers, when I grew them the first time, I was amazed at how beautiful they are, the plants themselves. You could give it a go if you have them on hand and see what happens. And, if nothing else, they'll just be smaller. I did want to talk a little bit about a couple of things for both experienced and beginning gardeners. Is that, it's an outdoor experience, and hopefully we have a very healthy, natural environment. Not only our soils, our plants themselves, but the whole world around our garden. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, that's one of the beautiful things about doing it. seeing pollinators and all these different insects, critters and whatnot. But we do have, it is important to be able to identify pests so that we can determine whether it's insects, weeds, or disease. So we can figure out what's best to do, what steps we should take. And I would recommend, particularly for an experienced gardener, beginning gardener, it's nice to have this just for fun and also start developing the skills of looking at both sides of our plants very closely. It's a hand lens. I call it hand lens. It's a loop. If you can, get the best quality lens that you can. 10 power is ideal. You'll be able to see things that you can't see with the naked eye, like spider mites, things like that. A hand lens is a really valuable tool to have in the garden to help determine what's going on with pests and whatnot. Now, all that being said, anybody who has an issue with disease, pests, or insects, we have 3 qualified, myself included, competent plant health experts to diagnose what's going on, prognosis hopefully, and steps to be taken. And we also have a microscope here on site, so you can see what we're talking about on the monitor. You have another question?
Sure. I wanted to ask you about organic gardening. So organic fertilizers and organic plants, and
right.
Do you have to do
right.
both in order for it to be organic? And how do you do that?
So so for a farmer or someone to produce organic vegetables to sell in the marketplace, it all starts from the very beginning, and they have to have certified. OMRI-certified soils, fertilizers. The plants themselves are grown from certified organic seeds. So if organic vegetables, vegetable gardening, organic herbs, if that's important to you, then we need to have a resource for that. Unfortunately, we had a really great organic vendor, but that person shifted their business operations last year. And right now we don't have organic vendor. We have very high standards here at Lurvey, and it's very difficult to find an organic grower that can get the plants to us and whatnot. So unfortunately for that, we don't have organic vegetables. I'm glad you asked the question though about organic fertilizers. These are 3 fertilizers from Espoma. Great company, been around since the 1920s. There's Garden Tone, Tomato Tone, and then Biotone Starter Fertilizer. The Biotone Starter we do when we plant our plants in the garden, just a one-time thing. What I'd like this is a really important question, and I'm really glad you asked. So I just grew up and always used synthetic fertilizers for my plants. And then about 20 years ago, I started learning more about organic fertilizers and realized that, that's really, truly the way that I would like to proceed. Because to really have a vigorous, lovely garden that's producing and giving us all the things that we hope to experience, it really is a factor of building really great soil. So when we fertilize, it's important to have the notion that what we're doing when we're going to use a fertilizer is we're going to feed the soil, right? That's what's so nice about organic fertilizers. The idea here is that we have microorganisms in the soil, earthworms, and we want a bunch of those. For example, ideally we would have in 1 tablespoon of our soil 1 billion microorganisms. And so, when we start getting to that point, that's when it's much more easier to do no-till gardening. And we're going to see a dramatic change in the vitality, the color, the amount of chlorophyll that we have in our plants. And then our soil itself is becoming more nutritious. So we can back off. We don't have to fertilize maybe as often as we would before we really get our soils to where we want it to be. So what's cool is the organic fertilizers is we're actually feeding the microbes and the earthworms that are in the soil. And then the side benefit is their excrement, their dead bodies, make the nutrients available for the plants then to take up. So with the synthetic fertilizers, we do one thing, and that's feed the plant. And if you want to do that, that's great, it works. But with organics, we're doing a number of things that really make a difference. I'll tell you, the second season after I switched to organics, it was just amazing, the results, and I've never gone back, particularly in the vegetable garden. One thing on tomatoes, too, if we can go back a little bit, for both the experienced gardener and the beginner, there are certain things that we need to look out for. Blossom end rot. We definitely want to rotate our garden. So when I plan my garden for the upcoming season, you know, if I grew potatoes over there, I'm going to grow them over here. If I grew my tomatoes over here, I'm definitely moving my tomatoes to another place in the garden. If we keep growing tomatoes in the exact same soil year after year, even ones that are disease resistant, we're going to find ourselves becoming disappointed. And with the right disease, we could end up not being able to plant tomatoes in that space for 3 or 4 years. So rotate the crops, and particularly the tomatoes. Along with the fertilizing the tomatoes, what I often have people coming in, I had flowers, they went away and I have no tomatoes. So we call that blossom drop. And there's, you know, a number of things that we find that's contributing to that. And mostly it's environmental conditions. The weather, temperature, cold, too wet, too dry, wrong time of the year to have a really late cold spell, so pollinators make it difficult to move about and adequately pollinate our tomato flowers. And then it also can be that we've been giving them way too much nitrogen. And so, you know, maybe what we do as well is back off of the nitrogen and see how that goes. It's correctable, and what we find often is that it changes, and we'll start getting pollinated flowers and tomatoes. Zucchini and summer squash. I love those. I grow them. They're bush form. You know, it's easy if we plant 1 or 2 plants too many to end up with so much zucchini and summer squash. We don't really know what quite to do with them, given the neighbors and whatnot. So if you find that you have eaten a lot of zucchini because there's just so many of them out there, and you want to back off a little bit, all you have to do is go out and pinch the flowers off. There's a male flower and a female flower on zucchinis and squash. You just remove the flowers, and now the plant will be fine, but you're postponing the development of the vegetable itself. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Great. Any more questions? Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, I think we got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, is it really necessary to mulch my vegetable garden?
It isn't entirely necessary. There can be advantage here because of our, you know, we're in a northern climate. Some people mulch with black plastic, and the reason primarily for that is that it heats our soil so we can get started a little sooner. I don't like that for a number of reasons, because I want to be incorporating stuff as I go through into my soil. So mulch is an organic matter. It's not certified organic, but it's going to break down. I like shredded hardwood mulch because it's kind of fluffy and it has some good insulation capacities. So it helps moderate the soil temperatures for our roots, helps keep moisture in the soil, keep it a little more consistent. And then it also, one of the main reasons I mulch my vegetable garden with shredded hardwood mulch is even if when I start there are no weeds anywhere visible, weed seeds are always blowing around, and they'll settle in that mulch and germinate. And if I'm dutiful in my gardening, I'll see the weeds start to germinate, and the roots haven't gotten into the soil yet. They're still in the mulch. So it makes it extremely easy to manage weeds in the garden. One thing on mulch, we never want the mulch touching the stem of the plant, whether it's a 200-year-old oak tree, the trunk, or tomato plants, or a hosta. We never want that mulch to touch that structure of the stem or trunk of the plant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I got one more question. I want to just, wondering if you could talk a little bit about insecticides and, keeping the bugs away, and is once a week enough, or how often should I be doing that? And, that's something that makes me uncomfortable, I guess.
Yeah, and this is again, this is an extremely important question. One reason why I have a very nice hand lens. So I've mentioned, and I do this purposely, I've mentioned pollinators during our brief time here together, right? There are so many beneficial insects in our vegetable garden, in our garden beds, our borders and whatnot. There's 3,400 species of bees in North America, and they're all pollinators. So in terms of just kind of like doing a weekly application of insecticides, one, we're putting insecticides into the environment when there's a good chance we don't really need to. Two, there's a good chance that we're going to kill all these wonderful beneficial insects. We mentioned honeybees, and there's also parasitic wasps that are helping us, by preying on insects that we don't want in the garden. So when we just make these kind of like prophylactic applications of insecticides, chances are we're doing more harm than good. The other thing that's very important about this question is if we do see pests, whether it is disease or insects and weeds, it's extremely important to know their life cycles. Is it a complete life cycle or is it incomplete? When they're immature, are they nymphs or are they larvae? These things are really important because if we understand the life cycles, if we find we do have to do a chemical intervention, but we'll know the proper time to do it. Grubworms in the lawn, that's another one of my areas of expertise, is turf. Grubworms in the lawn, they're only actively feeding for a few weeks in the middle of the summer, and that's the time to do an application, but only if we need to. So I'm really glad you asked that question. In other words, we follow the tenets very, very vigorously of integrated pest management. So we want to identify the pest, we want to know its life cycle, and then we want to take measures to manage that pest. Maybe our garden needs to be diversified in terms of plant material. And then so that we go through a number of steps, cultural practices. The best thing to do is mechanically picking them off, particularly in a small home vegetable garden. More often than not, we can just take those unwanted pests, pick them off, and throw them in a bucket of soapy water. But the last, always, when we follow integrated pest management and those tenets, the last place we want to end up is taking chemical control measures. There's a lot of ways to avoid that. For example, if we find we have aphids feeding on our plants, we can take the water hose and just blast them off of there. We may have to do that repeatedly. Not repeatedly, but 1 or 2, 3 times. But there we've taken a measure where we're dealing with that specific pest at the right time in a way that nothing is moving around in our garden or in our immediate environment except water. That's a beautiful thing. So yeah, those are great questions.
Well, thank you so much, Marty. This has been really, really helpful, and I know that we're all itching to get outside, and when the May snow is gone, we'll be ready to go.
Yeah.
This is the first of 4 virtual webinars that we're hosting. The next one is on May 26th, and that's on seasonal color and how to add seasonal color to your garden. The third one is on June 2nd, and that's staff picks. And as you can see, the staff at Lurvey's is super knowledgeable, so I'm sure we're going to get a lot of great ideas from them. And then the fourth one is on June 9th, and that's embracing your outdoor space. And so we'll be talking about things like fire pits and adding things like that to your garden. So stay tuned. You just go to events.dailyherald.com to register. And the other bonus of registering is that you will get a coupon each week that is tied to the topic that they'll be talking about. So thank you again, Marty. Thank you, Lurvey's, and happy gardening, everyone.
Keep